Member for Ancillary Canneries.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I rise to support this bill, I would like to first salute and thank the people and the government of the Republic of China, Taiwan, for their continued commitment and for their ever-strengthening partnership with the government and the people of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, I would like to bring my own thanks to them for the many projects, including the loan that we're discussing, the motion being discussed here today, for the many projects and development initiatives that they have undertaken in our various communities. And on behalf of my constituents, I would like to register our sincerest and most heartfelt gratitude for their long-term commitment towards the development of our people in St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, much has been said today about this motion laid here by the Minister of Finance, which seeks to borrow $100 million from the Taiwanese bank. Mr. Speaker, the airport project, I would like to reiterate, has been eloquently mentioned here by quite a few speakers on this side. I cannot stress, Mr. Speaker, how critical the airport development project is and how important it is, Mr. Speaker, for the continued advancement of the tourism sector and for the continued building of the capacity of the government to create jobs and economic opportunity through the development of the tourism industry, which, Mr. Speaker, today accounts for somewhere in the region of about 65% of direct, indirect, and induced contribution of our GDP. Mr. Speaker, at present, the island records in the region of 386,000 stayover arrivals in international tourists that come to our country. Mr. Speaker, this figure continues to rise significantly because the latest stats from the Tourist Board suggest that we have an overall tourist arrival increase of about 10.2%. But leading that charge, Mr. Speaker, is the stayover arrivals, which records, Mr. Speaker, a 2.6% increase. Mr. Speaker, this follows a figure last year which showed that stayover arrivals grew by some 10%. And if we do an average, Mr. Speaker, of the last 5 years, we will see that the growth rate is quite healthy. And the path of the arrivals for tourism over the last 10 years, we would see that the trend has been upward, barring crisis situations such as 9/11 and also the world economic crash. It therefore, Mr. Speaker, suggests very clearly in terms of the numbers that the airport project has become absolutely necessary to not only end the overcrowding situation at Urinora International Airport, but, Mr. Speaker, it does one fundamental thing, and that is it increases the customer experience to our destination, Mr. Speaker, and it improves, Mr. Speaker, the reputation of that destination. And so when I hear arguments that suggest that or fight against the development of this project, Mr. Speaker, I take very strong umbrage to it. And, Mr. Speaker, it leaves me rather perplexed that we would actually have such suggestions coming out of the belly of the opposition. Mr. Speaker, tourism is our bread and butter. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to service that sector. There's no bones about this. We absolutely need to ensure that the necessary investments are made so that St. Lucia remains competitive. We look at projects that are happening. Montego Bay Airport was mentioned today. The government of Antigua has also completed a massive upgrading, a new terminal at the international airport there. Just next door, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mr. Speaker, have actually instituted a brand new airport. And albeit they don't have the room stock to support their airport as yet, Mr. Speaker, the airport certainly has made them a lot more competitive as a tourist jurisdiction. Mr. Speaker, there are several projects in the pipeline for St. Lucia, projects that could yield results of about 2,000 new hotel rooms, Mr. Speaker, in the next 5 to 10 years. And Mr. Speaker, what you don't want to do is to increase that capacity and then all of a sudden find yourself in a place whereby you need to do something about your airport. And so what we are doing here, Mr. Speaker, is to philosophically make the point that we have to be proactive about how we go about developing this country. And the airport certainly is one of those projects by which this government hopes to continue on that trend, whereby we are proactive, Mr. Speaker, rather than reactive to the various developmental agendas. Mr. Speaker, much has been said about the rise of the debt to GDP ratio by the opposition as we debate the financing of this project. But Mr. Speaker, little has been said about the revenue ratio, the debt servicing ratio of the country. And I wonder, Mr. Speaker, whether this is convenient by the opposition to tell the people, well, you know, the debt to GDP ratio is going to be impacted, but not at all mention, Mr. Speaker, the fundamental point is that there will be no negative impact on the debt servicing ratio in the immediate term of the country. I don't think that anyone has said today that they can foresee the debt servicing ratio being impacted. And Mr. Speaker, a fiscal picture cannot be painted, and it is very much incomplete without making sure that you measure and you analyze all the fiscal indicators of the country. So while, yes, the debt to GDP ratio will be impacted, that is natural that if you're going to borrow money. But what does the opposition have to say about the debt servicing ratio, which certainly is going to receive much safeguarding here today? Because the Prime Minister has said over and over and over, like a stock record, Mr. Speaker, that this project does not only come with a $35 revenue stream for SLASPA, but Mr. Speaker, don't forget that this has given us the opportunity to raise $73 in new revenue per passenger. And so, Mr. Speaker, in addition to $35 per passenger, which goes to servicing this loan, the government still has at its disposal to make other strategic and smart fiscal decisions, Mr. Speaker, with an additional 35 and how much is 73? Your math is very good. $48. No, you're misleading me.
About $78 you said.
Right? And so, Mr. Speaker, there's still a lot more money. So one of the things that we said that we will do, and the leader of the opposition quoted the IMF report, but really failed to say to this honor of the House, Mr. Speaker, that one of the things that the IMF has said to us and has given St. Lucia flying colors for is for pioneering the Climate Change Resilient Fund. And St. Lucia is being used, Mr. Speaker, as a pilot project. Mr. Speaker, it is in his report, right? St. Lucia is being used as a pilot project, Mr. Speaker, in the, it is already a document of the House, so you figure it out. St. Lucia, Mr. Speaker, is already being seen as a project, Mr. Speaker, whereby the rest of the Caribbean will have an opportunity to follow. Many governments, Mr. Speaker, we've had the irritation of dealing with the administrative bureaucracy and responding to natural disasters. Mr. Speaker, in my own constituency, I can think of the road from Venus to Ancillary. Since Hurricane Tomas, Mr. Speaker, we have been struggling to restore much needed infrastructure that are caused by landslides. And so, Mr. Speaker, as we go through the administrative hurdles with international donor agencies, one of the missteps we have seen in our financing and in the way we treat the fiscal space of the country is our lack of capacity, Mr. Speaker, to take action and to take action quickly. My information is from the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Speaker, our sinking fund has already accumulated $17 million. And this means, Mr. Speaker, that the liquidity of the country has been improved significantly, Mr. Speaker. And so while some of our friends on the other side are going to argue about, while some of us are going to argue, Mr. Speaker.
Honorable member. Yes, the honorable leader of the opposition, please allow this. Very well. Continues.
Yeah. And while, Mr. Speaker, some on the other side may argue about paying the money down on the immediate balances or the deficits that exist, Mr. Speaker, with a sinking fund, you have the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to also make some interventions to cure national emergencies like responding to disasters. And so, Mr. Speaker, while you may have a situation here, Mr. Speaker, where we're talking about financing the airport, what we're doing here, Mr. Speaker, is bigger than financing the airport. Because with this, Mr. Speaker, it gave us the opportunity for government to deal with the wider revenue management of the country, to deal with the wider financing of major projects for national, economic, and social development which are required. But, Mr. Speaker, there are people who make pronouncements in the House, and they have very little understanding of economics or business or financing a government or managing it. And so, Mr. Speaker, well, and so we proved it the last time we came to this honorable House. Remember, there is a big pronouncement about the debt to GDP ratio. And the member for Labrie, and I'm not misquoting him, he said the debt to GDP ratio is so bad. But when they asked him what the GDP ratio, the debt to GDP ratio was, he couldn't tell us. He couldn't tell us, Mr. Speaker. And the gentleman, the gentleman from
Mr. Speaker, on a point of order.
So, Mr. Speaker.
On a point of order, sir.
You know, Mr. Speaker, the member for ancillary canneries is misleading the House. I never use any subjective words like very bad or bad. You say it's high. In fact, after the sitting of the House, Mr. Speaker, had he just done a basic search, but I said what the point of order is misleading the House. And what prudential limits set for developed countries, like 40%, and for developing countries, 60%. That's what they consider to be prudent. So when the member stands in this House and try to ridicule proper economics and misrepresent and try to mislead the House into believing that I said what I never said, Mr. Speaker. Now, this is not a playground for children, Mr. Speaker, and I've said that before.
Honorable member for Labrie.
No, it's not very bad.
Honorable member for Labrie, you stood on a point of order that the member is misleading the House. In other words, that he's saying something that you did not see, but you didn't tell me.
Mr. Speaker, I am quite conversant with the subject of economics. I never use anything like bad or very bad. Now, last sitting, he said so. I corrected him. And apparently, he has come to this House, and he wants to assume the dual role of being a parliamentary nuisance and a political irritant in this House. This is not a playground for children.
Honorable member. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud.
Speaker is not done.
Honorable Member for Library. He is your colleague. Regardless if he's on this side or the other side, he is still your colleague in this house. Yeah. And in this house, the words that we use to describe our colleagues are not what you just said. So, you didn't. Yes, very well. Yes, very well. Thank you very much. Honourable Member for Ancillary Canneries. Continue, sir. Yes, I will. Yes.
And so, Mr. Speaker,
Honourable Member for Ancillary Canneries, we've gone that road the last time, and the member is taking issue with the fact that you keep saying that he's using some adjectives and adverbs that he did not use.
and so, Mr. Speaker,
So I'm just cautioning you that do not ascribe to the good member words like bad and very bad and good. Very well, continue, sir.
and so, Mr. Speaker, while I'm very proud of my youth, and I will not hold the honourable member's old age against him, what I will hold against him is when he comes to this honourable house and he doesn't know what he's talking about. And so, Mr. Speaker, I am not young enough to know, Mr. Speaker, when an opposition politician is bluffing the people. And so if you are going to make an assessment of a fiscal indicator, then the least you can do is to know when you say that the debt to GDP ratio is high, that you're supposed to be able to quantify high. And you're supposed to be able to tell us specifically where is the debt to GDP ratio today. And so it is with that same kind of mirrors, that same kind of duplicity, that same kind of misrepresentation of the facts that the opposition has approached this debate today, which is why I started out by telling you that they have come in and they have spoken about the debt, but they have mentioned nothing about the revenues, the new revenues which this project is attained as a result of this project. They have mentioned nothing about the impact, the positive impact this will have on the debt servicing ratio. Because, Mr. Speaker, they have come in this house and they have only got one thing, and that is to cause scare in this country, that is to fight everything we do, whether it is good, that is to be an enemy of the progress and the development of this country. And I made that absolutely clear. So that is the fundamental point. That is the point that is being developed here. And so it's not that I wish to make the member look bad. I think the whole nation knows that he just uses big words, and there's no substance behind the big words that he uses. So, but I have a more substantive part of the debate to move on with. And so, Mr. Speaker, in keeping with his theme, Mr. Speaker, we have to come and we have to debate this with facts. And so, Mr. Speaker, the other thing that we see in the opposition's double standards, Mr. Speaker, is the whole question of public-private sector partnerships. And again, Mr. Speaker, more duplicity. So quite a few of the members, the two members spoken today, have had a lot to say. They have derided the government for not going with the PPP. But, Mr. Speaker, the philosophy is very simple. Why give other people things to do that you can do for yourself? And so what they are saying to us, Mr. Speaker, is allow foreigners to bleed us. They're comfortable with that arrangement. They're comfortable with people coming and extract and exploit the resources of this country, the assets of this country, Mr. Speaker, and get wealthy. But we, Mr. Speaker, on this side, we are committed to making sure that we make very smart and prudent decisions as it relates to where government should get involved and where government should not get involved. And so if we look at Lucia, for example, it has been well established that in a sector like the energy sector, where it is profitable and where it is strategic for governments to get involved, there are 3 of our public sector agencies that collectively own 45% of Lucia shares. And that has helped, Mr. Speaker, their own bottom line over time. And that is how you manage a country. When it comes to SLASPA, Mr. Speaker, as it relates to this airport, we see that SLASPA, Mr. Speaker, last year they turned over $6 million in profits. And SLASPA has had a consistent record, Mr. Speaker, of turning over profits. And they have been no shortage of management capacity, of building up the ports of our country, whether it's the airports or the seaports, Mr. Speaker. And they have proven, Mr. Speaker, that they can manage the resources of this country. So if they have shown us that they can, why should we take away the airport? Why should we take away the opportunity to gain more revenue? Mr. Speaker, we must also bear in mind that this country has a very narrow tax base. We must also bear in mind that very few people pay taxes. And governments are always on the hunt, Mr. Speaker, to find alternative revenue. And if you can, why give it away? Why allow people to bleed you? Why allow people to hemorrhage you? Why allow people for 30 years to make money on the backs of the resources of this country? And this is the fundamental thing. And so the difference, Mr. Speaker, the difference is, and I'm glad he brought up the issue of health care, is that while we have proven that we can manage airports and we can manage seaports with SLASPA, is that it has also shown with history that we cannot run our healthcare system and finance it with a profit. That is well known. And the results, including their own failed universal health care project, has failed. And including all of the initiatives that they have done, Mr. Speaker, have shown us whereby there is a dearth in the capacity of us to do it by ourselves. But when it comes to managing our airports, we've done a very good job. We are turning over profits. This initiative gives us a chance, Mr. Speaker, to look at the overall financing of our government, look at the overall financing to make strategic, economic and social development interventions, Mr. Speaker. And so I want to, at this time, applaud this initiative by the Prime Minister. I absolutely commend him, Mr. Speaker, for the mechanism through which he has chosen with the Cabinet of Ministers to make sure that this project becomes a hallmark in the development of St. Lucia. Mr. Speaker, a lot has been said as well, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member for Castries South, and I'm going to defend my colleague, Minister, went on to state about why are we doing this while schools are being closed? Why are we doing, I mean, do we really have to go that low? Do we really have to be so petty in this debate? But fail to mention, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Education this year and still is in the process of upgrading our schools nationally with a $10 million project. And I want to say thank you, use the Honorable House to say thank you to her for all of the investments that she has made in schools in my constituency, in their complete rehabilitation. And so the people, the students in the Canaries infant school now are better off than they ever was under the leadership of the St. Lucia Labour Party. Thank you, Minister. The students of the ancillary primary school are absolutely in a better position than they were ever under the 10 or 15 years of this administration. Thank you very much, Madam Minister, for your generosity. And, Mr. Speaker, I thank her so much for the investments she has made in the ancillary infant school, even though it is owned by the Catholic, Mr. Speaker. She has went in there and she has enabled and boosted the infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, but my gratitude for the Minister of Education is not complete as yet, because I must also thank her for schools in Millet. I must also thank her for schools in Jackmel. And so as we spend, Mr. Speaker, 10 times more than we have on rehabbing our schools in St. Lucia, all across the country, Mr. Speaker, I find it absolutely disappointing and absolutely sorrowful that the member for Castries South would misrepresent the facts as it relates to the minister's own record and the government's own record on the development of schools and the attention that we have given to them. And I reject that statement that we're spending money on an airport whilst we are neglecting the schools and closing secondary schools. This is the sort of rant that they go on. Try to mislead the public. Try to tell people lies. They have one statement or a position in a particular matter while they're in government. I mean, recently, Mr. Speaker, I've had cause to tell the second leader of the party, what is his real position on DSH? Right?
Honorable member.
What is his real position on DSH?
Honorable member.
What is his real position?
Honorable member
so
for Canries.
I will leave this house today. The damage is done.
Honorable member, please don't. I have allowed you all the latitude to thank the honorable minister, but I think you've crossed the boundary. So can you get back to the motion at hand, please?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, as we debate this important motion, it's important that we're consistent in our positions. It's either we support PPP or we don't. What is our real position on PPPs? It's either, Mr. Speaker, we support raising the taxes. I mean, we have debated in this honorable house that this same duplicity, where they have come in and they said that this project will enhance or it will affect tourism arrivals. They said that the extra revenue will make us uncompetitive. They argue that when we came to this honorable house to set the fees. And then what did we see, right? A cabinet conclusion by them intending to do the very same thing. The very same thing of increasing the airport development tax by $55. The same thing that they said while they were in opposition. It is unthinkable. It is unconscionable for the UWP government to have done. But, Mr. Speaker, it is all in the name of politics. And that's what's sad about this whole debate. As I sat and listened to it, very little facts, very little care for the development of this country. Mr. Speaker, I remain unconvinced that the MPs on the opposite side are concerned about the impact that this could have on the development of our country. But they are just looking, Mr. Speaker, for every opportunity where they can extract political mileage. And that has been true on their position on Dolphin Parks. That has been true on their position on DSH. That has been true on their position on borrowing. Mr. Speaker, the gentlemen have the heart. You know, they say men lie, women lie, but numbers don't. Mr. Speaker, on table 38 of the Social and Economic Review, okay? And I'm going to use, it's a table, table 38. It has a number of years. You check it. You have one. And so, Mr. Speaker, I will use the last, the years from 2011 to 2016. Mr. Speaker, the total outstanding liabilities for the government of St. Lucia in the year 2011 was $2.378 billion. Mr. Speaker, under the leadership of the member for Viewfort South, who was the former Minister for Finance, Mr. Speaker, in 5 years, they racked it up to over $3 billion. $3 $3 billion. And so, Mr. Speaker, we see a massive increase of over $800 million, Mr. Speaker, in the stock of debt increased by that administration. Now, if I went back, Mr. Speaker, and you use this book, the years between 1997 and 2001, you will see, Mr. Speaker, that when the United Workers' Party administration demitted office in 97, the debt to GDP ratio was just over 40%, well below prudential limits, right? By the time they, and I use a word from the member for Micoud South, Micoud North, while as leader of the opposition of this House, called him the worst economic manager in the Caribbean. And I endorse that statement today, Mr. Speaker, because it is clear in the numbers. She wasn't lying. The numbers supported her. So how could we take anything from the worst economic manager in the Caribbean? I cannot do that. And I say so with no bones. You cannot come and fool people with words, but you must back up your words with what the stats are saying. By the time he demitted office in 2001, the debt to GDP ratio, right, was near prudential limits. Borrowed and spent and taxed and did all kinds of stuff, like it was a frenzy. And now today, they are criticizing us for borrowing. I tell you the figures, go and find them. Doubt what I say, right? Right? So, Mr. Speaker, I have no time for them. I have no time for their misrepresentation of the facts. Mr. Speaker, I have no time for their ill-fated economics. And Mr. Speaker, I have absolutely no time for the self-interest. Mr. Speaker, what I have time for is for development. What I have time for, Mr. Speaker, is for creating jobs. What I have time for, Mr. Speaker, is building this airport so that we can become more competitive. What I have time for, Mr. Speaker, is to make sure that we do everything we can as a government to create jobs and to create more business linkage, Mr. Speaker, for the people of St. Lucia and for the economy of St. Lucia, for small businesses. That's what I have time for. I have no time to listen to the boring debates that come from the other side that are just talking, misrepresenting facts. That when you ask them to show you figures to back it up, they absolutely cannot do it. And so that's the point, Mr. Speaker. Let us be consistent in this House. Let us back up what we say. Let us show the numbers. You can't be criticizing us, and then you did the very same thing. In fact, you did worse, right? This is a loan guarantee. This is making sure that we institute a revenue stream to repay the financing. And the Minister of Finance has said so. And you know what? I suspect, Mr. Speaker, that it may have something to do with what has been said. Because I believe that not too soon from now, we might be able to rate Alan Chasney as the best MP Vieux-Fort South has ever had. Thank you very much. Yeah. The airport is in Vieux-Fort South.